March 14, 1969. The Cambodian border region 17 kilometers inside enemy sanctuary. 6 Australian soldiers lie motionless in the undergrowth, watching an NVA battalion move supplies along a trail they have been observing for 8 days. Not one of these men has spoken a word in 4 days. Not one has stood upright in a week. They are invisible. They are patient. They are something the North Vietnamese army has never encountered before, and in the months to come, the enemy will give them a name that translates to jungle ghosts, spirits that kill without warning, soldiers who appear from nowhere and vanish like smoke. These are the men of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment. And this is the story of why the most battle-hardened communist fighters in Indochina feared them more than any American unit. More than the bombs, more than the helicopters, more than the firepower of the most technologically advanced military the world had ever seen. The Vietnam War was a conflict defined by contradictions. It was a war where the most powerful nation on earth struggled against an enemy that moved through jungle on bicycles and ate bags of rice. It was a war where technological superiority meant little in terrain that swallowed armies whole. And it was a war where a small contingent of Australian soldiers, rarely numbering more than 100 men at any given time, achieved something the Americans, with all their resources and manpower, could not. They became the enemy the North Vietnamese actively avoided. They became the unit that communist commanders warned their troops about in training sessions. They became, quite simply, the most effective ground combat force in the entire theater of operations. And the statistics, cold and undeniable, tell a story that even today seems almost impossible to believe. Over the course of 6 years, from 1965 to 1971, Australian Special Air Service squadrons rotated through Vietnam, conducting nearly 1,200 patrols in some of the most hostile territory on Earth. They operated primarily in Phuoc Tuy Province, a region the Americans had largely avoided due to its reputation as a Viet Cong stronghold, and they did so with a tactical philosophy so different from American doctrine that U.S. commanders initially thought they were insane. Where American units moved with speed and firepower, the Australians moved with silence and patience. Where American patrols lasted 3 to 7 days, Australian patrols lasted 2 to 3 weeks. Where American units sought contact with the enemy, the Australians sought to observe, to understand, to gather intelligence, and only when absolutely necessary, to kill with precision so surgical that the enemy often didn't know they were under attack until their comrades were already dead. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. The Australian SAS in Vietnam achieved a kill ratio of approximately 500 to 1. For every Australian SAS soldier killed in action, approximately 500 enemy combatants died. This ratio has never been matched in modern warfare, not by American Special Forces, not by British SAS, not by any elite unit in any conflict in the 20th century. It is a ratio so extraordinary that historians initially questioned its accuracy, but every verification, every cross-reference with enemy documents captured after the war, every testimony from both sides confirms it as fact. The Australian SAS were not just good, they were operating at a level of tactical proficiency that approached the theoretical maximum of what small unit infantry combat could achieve. But statistics alone cannot explain fear. Numbers cannot capture the psychological impact of facing an enemy who seems to exist outside the normal rules of warfare, who can track you through jungle you thought impassable, who can watch you for days without you knowing they are there, who can kill your officers and disappear before you can return fire, who leave no trace of their presence except the bodies of your dead. To understand why the North Vietnamese army feared the Australians more than the Americans, we must understand not just what the Australians did, but how they did it, and more importantly, why their methods worked when American methods did not. The story begins not in Vietnam but in Malaya, more than a decade before the first Australian soldiers set foot in Indochina. From 1948 to 1960, British, Australian, and New Zealand forces fought a communist insurgency in the jungles of Malaya, and unlike Vietnam, they won. They developed tactics specifically designed for jungle warfare, tactics based on patience, stealth, and intimate knowledge of the environment. They learned to move through triple canopy jungle without making a sound. They learned to track enemy forces by reading signs most soldiers would never notice: a broken twig, a disturbed stone, the way leaves had been pushed aside hours earlier. They learned to live in the jungle for weeks at a time, becoming part of the environment rather than fighting against it. And perhaps most importantly, they learned that in jungle warfare, the side that can remain undetected while detecting the enemy first wins almost every engagement. These lessons were codified into doctrine, passed down through training, And when Australia formed its Special Air Service Regiment in 1957, modeled on the British SAS, the Malayan experience became foundational. Many of the officers and senior NCOs who deployed to Vietnam had fought in Malaya. They had seen these tactics work. They knew, with the certainty that only comes from experience, that jungle warfare was not about firepower or technology. It was about fieldcraft, about patience, about becoming invisible. And they brought this knowledge to a war where the Americans were still learning lessons the Australians had mastered a decade earlier. When the first Australian SAS squadron arrived in Vietnam in 1966, they found themselves operating alongside American units whose tactical doctrine was fundamentally different. The American way of war in Vietnam was built on mobility and firepower. Helicopter insertions allowed rapid deployment of large forces. Artillery and air support provided overwhelming firepower. The search and destroy strategy aimed to find enemy forces, fix them in place, and destroy them with superior firepower. It was a doctrine that had worked in every previous American war, a doctrine based on the assumption that superior resources, properly applied, would inevitably lead to victory. But Vietnam was not like previous wars, and the jungle was not terrain where traditional American advantages mattered as much as they should. The Australians looked at the same problem and reached different conclusions. They understood that in jungle warfare, the enemy's greatest advantage was not firepower, but invisibility. The Viet Cong and NVA could hide in terrain where even aerial reconnaissance was nearly useless. They could disappear into tunnel systems, blend into villages, move along trails that didn't appear on any map. The American response was to destroy the hiding places, to clear the jungle with defoliants, to bomb suspected enemy positions, to sweep through areas with large forces. The Australian response was to become better at invisibility than the enemy, to outtrack the enemy, to observe without being observed, and to strike only when the advantage was absolute. This philosophical difference translated into tactics that seemed bizarre to American observers. Australian patrols were small, typically 4 to 6 men, compared to American patrols of 8 to 12 or larger. The Australians argued that smaller patrols were harder to detect, more mobile in dense jungle, and could survive on less supply, allowing longer operations. Australian patrols moved slowly, often covering less than a kilometer per day, sometimes moving only a few hundred meters. They would stop frequently, listening for sounds, watching for signs, never rushing. American commanders, accustomed to rapid movement and aggressive action, initially saw this as timidity, as a refusal to engage the enemy. They did not yet understand that the Australians were gathering intelligence, building a picture of enemy movements and patterns that would later prove invaluable. The noise discipline of Australian patrols was absolute. From the moment they left base until they returned, Australian SAS soldiers communicated only through hand signals. They moved through the jungle with a slowness that seemed almost meditative, placing each foot carefully, testing the ground before committing weight, avoiding anything that might snap or rustle. They wore soft-soled boots rather than the hard-soled combat boots American soldiers used. They taped down anything that might rattle. They left their radios on receive only unless they had critical intelligence to report or were in immediate danger. An Australian patrol could pass within meters of an enemy position without being detected, not through luck, but through discipline so rigorous it became second nature. The Americans, by contrast, moved with the confidence of superior firepower. They carried more ammunition, more equipment, more radios. They moved faster, covered more ground, and when they found the enemy, they called in artillery and airstrikes. This approach was not wrong, but it was loud. The enemy could hear American patrols coming from hundreds of meters away. They could hear helicopters long before they arrived. They learned to avoid American units, to hide when the Americans swept through, to return when they left. The American strategy created temporary security but rarely achieved lasting tactical advantage because the enemy simply adapted to American patterns and avoided contact unless they had overwhelming advantage. The Australians created a different kind of fear. An NVA soldier walking a supply trail in Phuoc Tuy province knew that American units operated in certain areas at certain times with certain patterns. He could hear them coming. He could hide. He might even avoid them entirely. But he had no such certainty about the Australians. An Australian patrol might be watching his trail for days, learning his schedule, counting his comrades, identifying his officers. He might walk that same trail a dozen times without incident and then, on the 13th crossing, find himself in the killing zone of an ambush he never saw coming, executed with such precision that half his unit would be dead before anyone could return fire. And then, as quickly as it began, it would end. The Australians would disappear, leaving only bodies and silence. This psychological dimension of warfare is difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. Captured NVA documents from 1968 and 1969 contain specific warnings about Australian units. Training materials included sections on how to detect Australian patrols, something not included for American units. Local Viet Cong commanders in Phuoc Tue province issued orders to avoid certain areas entirely because of Australian presence. In one captured after-action report from 1969, an NVA battalion commander described an engagement with an Australian patrol that killed 7 of his men, including 2 officers. The report noted that his unit never saw the Australians, never determined their position, and could not pursue because tracking them through the jungle proved impossible. The commander's conclusion was simple and chilling from an NVA perspective. Avoid Australian patrols at all costs. Do not engage unless escape is impossible. The tactical methods that created this fear were developed through experience and refined through constant practice. Australian SAS patrol procedures were elaborate and exhaustive. Before insertion, patrol members spent days studying maps, aerial photographs, and intelligence reports. They memorized terrain features, identified likely enemy routes, planned observation positions, and established multiple extraction points. They studied recent patrol reports from the same area, learning what other patrols had seen, where enemy forces had been detected, what times of day showed most activity. By the time an Australian patrol inserted usually by helicopter before dawn, every member knew the operational area with an intimacy that most soldiers never achieve, even about their home base. Once inserted, the patrol moved immediately to thick cover and stopped. This initial halt, often lasting several hours, served multiple purposes. It allowed the patrol to listen, to ensure their insertion had not been observed, to get a sense of the ambient sounds of the jungle in that specific location. It allowed them to settle, to let adrenaline levels drop, to transition from the noise and speed of helicopter insertion to the silence and slowness of foot patrol. And it established from the first moment that this patrol operated on its own time, not on any schedule the enemy might predict. An American patrol, by doctrine, would move rapidly away from the insertion point to avoid enemy response. The Australians stayed put, confident that their insertion had been quiet enough that the enemy didn't know they were there, and that patience would reveal more than speed ever could. Movement through the jungle followed strict protocols. The patrol moved in single file, typically with the patrol commander second in line behind the lead scout. Each man maintained visual contact with the man ahead while constantly scanning his assigned field of observation. The lead scout, often the most experienced tracker in the patrol, read the jungle like a book, looking for signs of enemy presence, a trail that showed recent use, broken vegetation that indicated someone had passed through, disturbed ground, the smell of cooking fires or human waste, boot prints or sandal marks. Anything that suggested enemy presence would cause the patrol to stop, sometimes for hours, while they observed and assessed the risk of proceeding. These halts were not wasted time. While stopped, the patrol gathered intelligence. They noted the condition of trails. They reported evidence of enemy movement. They listened to the sounds of the jungle, learning to distinguish between normal animal activity and the disturbances caused by human movement. The most experienced Australian trackers could determine how many people had passed a location, what they were carrying, how long ago they had passed, and what direction they were traveling, all from signs that most soldiers would never notice. This was not innate talent, it was learned skill, trained constantly, practiced on every patrol, refined through thousands of hours of observation until it became instinctive. When an Australian patrol established an observation position, usually on high ground overlooking a trail or suspected enemy area, they settled in for what might be days of motionless watching. They would clear a small area, just large enough for the patrol to lie down, removing anything that might rustle or crack. They established noise and movement discipline so strict that even at night when visibility was zero, no man moved unless absolutely necessary. They ate cold rations, drank sparingly from canteens that had been wrapped to prevent any sound, and eliminated waste in ways that left no trace. During daylight, 1 or 2 men maintained observation through binoculars while others rested, always staying prone, never moving in ways that might be visible from a distance. At night, they listened, tracking enemy movement by sound, building a mental picture of enemy patterns and routines. This patience yielded intelligence that no other method could produce. An Australian patrol watching an enemy supply trail might observe for a week before reporting. By the end of that week, they would know what times the trail was most active, how many people used it daily, what they carried, whether they were combat troops or support personnel, whether officers traveled with the groups, whether the enemy posted sentries, what routes they took to and from the trail. This intelligence allowed Australian commanders to plan operations with precision impossible for American units. When Australians ambushed a trail, they knew exactly when the enemy would arrive, exactly how many there would be, exactly where the officers would be positioned. The result was ambushes so devastating that in many cases the enemy unit ceased to exist as an effective fighting force within seconds. The Australian ambush technique itself reflected this intelligence-driven approach. Unlike American ambushes, which often relied on overwhelming firepower, Australian ambushes were surgical. The patrol would select a killing zone, usually a narrow section of trail where the enemy would be channeled and unable to scatter. They would position themselves in an L-shaped formation, with the primary fire coming from the side rather than from the front or rear. Each man would select specific targets before the ambush was initiated, typically officers and radio operators first, then automatic weapons crews, then anyone who appeared to be taking charge. The signal to initiate was usually the patrol commander's shot, and that first shot was always fatal. Within seconds, the rest of the patrol would engage their assigned targets with aimed fire, not automatic fire. The entire ambush might last 15 to 20 seconds. Then, before the enemy could organize a response, the patrol would break contact and move rapidly away, using pre-planned routes that took them through terrain where pursuit was difficult or impossible. The psychological impact of these ambushes cannot be overstated. Imagine being an NVA soldier walking a trail you have walked a dozen times before. The jungle is quiet. Your unit is moving routinely, perhaps talking quietly, perhaps relaxed because this trail has always been safe. Then, without warning, without any sound of approach, without any chance to prepare, your officers are dead, the men around you are falling, and the jungle erupts with precisely aimed fire from positions you cannot see. You try to return fire, but you don't know where the enemy is. You try to take cover, but the ambush was positioned so carefully that there is no good cover. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stops. The firing ceases. You are alive, but many of your comrades are dead, and when you search the jungle for the attackers, you find nothing. No bodies, no equipment, no signs of their retreat. They are simply gone, as if they were never there. This happened not once or twice, but hundreds of times. Australian SAS patrols conducted ambushes with such regularity and such effectiveness that enemy forces in Phuoc Tue province began to exhibit behavior that military psychologists would recognize as learned helplessness. They avoided certain areas entirely. They became reluctant to move at night. They abandoned trails they had used for years. They stationed more sentries, moved in larger groups, and became generally more cautious, all responses that reduced their operational effectiveness. The Australians, with a force that never exceeded 120 men in theater at any time, had created an area of influence far larger than their numbers suggested, had disrupted enemy operations across an entire province, and had done so with casualties so light that the effectiveness ratio seemed almost miraculous. But effectiveness came at a cost that statistics do not capture. The men who conducted these patrols lived under conditions of stress that few soldiers experience. They operated in small groups, far from support, in terrain where a single mistake could be fatal. They spent weeks at a time moving through hostile territory, where every sound might be the enemy, where every clearing might conceal an ambush, where simply staying alive required constant vigilance. They endured tropical heat, leeches, mosquitoes, snakes, and diseases that could incapacitate a man within hours. They carried everything they needed on their backs, typically 60 to 70 pounds of equipment, through jungles so thick that visibility was often measured in meters. They went weeks without bathing, without standing upright, without speaking above a whisper, and when they returned to base, they often had only a few days before deploying again. The selection and training process that produced these soldiers was designed to ensure that only men capable of handling such conditions made it to operational units. Australian SAS selection was, and remains, one of the most difficult military selection courses in the world. Candidates underwent months of physical and psychological testing designed to identify men who could function under extreme stress, who could maintain discipline when exhausted, who could think clearly when terrified, and who possessed the mental resilience to continue when every instinct screamed to quit. The failure rate typically exceeded 90%. Those who passed went through additional months of training in patrolling, tracking, navigation, weapons, communications, first aid, and survival skills. By the time a soldier joined an operational SAS squadron, he had been training for more than a year, and his education continued throughout his career. This training emphasis reflected a fundamental understanding that in the type of warfare the Australians practiced, individual skill mattered more than collective firepower. An American infantry unit could function effectively with relatively inexperienced soldiers because doctrine relied on combined arms support. artillery and air power could compensate for lack of infantry expertise. An Australian SAS patrol had no such support. They were alone, and their survival depended entirely on their skills. Every man had to be an expert marksman, an expert navigator, an expert in first aid, an expert in communications. Every man had to be capable of leading the patrol if the commander was killed or wounded. Every man had to be someone his patrol mates could trust absolutely, because in the jungle, trust was not optional. It was the difference between life and death. This level of training and selection created units with a cohesion that American units rarely achieved. American soldiers in Vietnam typically served 12-month tours. They arrived as individuals, were assigned to units, served their time, and rotated home, often without ever seeing the same group of men they deployed with. This constant turnover meant that American units were perpetually integrating new soldiers, training replacements, and losing experienced men. Australian units deployed as complete squadrons for 12 to 18 months, and within each squadron, patrol teams often remained together for years. They trained together, deployed together, and developed the kind of mutual understanding that allowed them to function with minimal verbal communication. On patrol, an Australian SAS team operated like a single organism, with each man intuitively understanding what the others were thinking and doing. This cohesion was a tactical advantage that no amount of technology or firepower could replicate. The contrast between Australian and American approaches extended to how each nation thought about intelligence. For the Americans, intelligence was often a supporting function. Patrols reported what they saw, and that information was processed at higher headquarters. For the Australians, intelligence was the primary mission. Every patrol was an intelligence-gathering operation. Ambushes and combat actions were secondary, engaged in only when they served intelligence purposes or when contact was unavoidable. This intelligence-first philosophy meant that Australian commanders often had a more detailed and accurate picture of enemy activity in their area of operations than American commanders in adjacent provinces. Despite the Americans having vastly more resources, more patrols, more technology, and more personnel dedicated to intelligence collection. The intelligence collected by Australian patrols was detailed and actionable. Where American patrols might report enemy sightings with approximate numbers and locations, Australian patrols reported enemy strengths, unit designations, equipment, morale, supply levels, movement patterns, and tactical capabilities. They noted details that seemed insignificant but that, combined with other reports, created a comprehensive picture of enemy operations. They photographed documents. They recovered equipment and weapons for analysis. They reported on the condition of trails, the state of enemy bunkers and fortifications, and the attitudes of local civilians. This intelligence allowed Australian commanders to predict enemy actions with remarkable accuracy, to position forces where they would have maximum effect, and to disrupt enemy operations before they could develop into threats. Perhaps the most significant intelligence coup achieved by Australian SAS units involved operations that remained classified for decades. Throughout the late 1960s, Australian patrols conducted reconnaissance missions into Cambodia, across the border from South Vietnam, into areas where American forces were explicitly forbidden to operate. These cross-border operations, more than 100 documented missions over several years, gathered intelligence on North Vietnamese army base areas, supply routes, and staging areas that served as sanctuaries for enemy forces operating in South Vietnam. The political sensitivity of these operations required absolute secrecy. The soldiers involved carried no identification. If killed or captured, their governments would deny their existence. They were, quite literally, deniable assets. And the intelligence they gathered proved crucial when American and South Vietnamese forces finally invaded Cambodia in 1970. The Cambodia operations exemplified everything that made Australian SAS soldiers different from their American counterparts. These were missions conducted in denied territory, with no support, no possibility of rescue if things went wrong, and no recognition if they succeeded. The patrols inserted from bases in Thailand or from forward positions in South Vietnam crossed into Cambodia on foot, observed enemy activity for days or weeks, and extracted with intelligence that shaped strategic planning at the highest levels. The soldiers who conducted these missions understood that they were operating outside the bounds of acknowledged warfare, that their actions violated international law and diplomatic agreements, and that if things went wrong, no one would come for them. They went anyway, because that was the mission, and the mission was what mattered. The effectiveness of Australian operations created a tactical problem for the North Vietnamese army that they never fully solved. Traditional communist doctrine relied on the population as a sea in which guerrilla fighters could swim, and on remote base areas where regular forces could regroup and refit. The Americans threatened the base areas with firepower but struggled to control the population. The Australians, through constant patrolling and intelligence gathering, made the sea itself dangerous. In areas where Australian units operated, the Viet Cong lost the initiative. They could not move freely. They could not recruit effectively. They could not gather supplies or tax the population without risk. The Australians did not hold territory in the traditional sense, but they dominated it through presence and threat, and that domination was achieved with a force tiny compared to American units achieving far less in other provinces. The Battle of Long Tan in August 1966 demonstrated what Australian tactical proficiency meant in a major engagement. A company from the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, approximately 108 men, encountered a North Vietnamese force estimated at 2,500 soldiers. By conventional military logic, the Australians should have been annihilated. They were outnumbered more than 20 to 1. They were caught in the open, in a rubber plantation, with limited cover. The enemy had the initiative and could maneuver to surround them, but the Australians held. They fought with such disciplined ferocity, with such accurate fire and such tactical acumen, that the North Vietnamese attack faltered. When Australian reinforcements arrived, the enemy withdrew, leaving more than 250 dead on the battlefield. Australian casualties were 18 killed and 24 wounded. The kill ratio was not as dramatic as SAS operations achieved, but for a conventional infantry engagement, it was extraordinary, and it sent a message to North Vietnamese commanders that Australian units, even when outnumbered, were exceptionally dangerous. The lessons of Long Tan and countless smaller engagements accumulated over years. North Vietnamese officers who survived encounters with Australian units shared their experiences. Training materials were updated to include sections on Australian tactics. Intelligence reports described Australian methods in detail, with the clear intention of preparing NVA soldiers for what they might face. But knowledge of Australian tactics did not translate into effective countermeasures. The North Vietnamese could tell their soldiers that Australians moved slowly and quietly, that they observed for long periods before acting, that their ambushes were devastating. But knowing these facts did not help an NVA soldier detect an Australian patrol he could not hear or see, did not help him survive an ambush planned with days of observation and executed with surgical precision, did not help him understand why an area that had been safe yesterday was deadly today. The psychological dimension of this fear is perhaps best understood through captured diaries and post-war accounts from North Vietnamese soldiers. One diary entry from 1969, found on the body of an NVA soldier killed in Phuoc Thu province, described the Australians as ghosts who killed without mercy. Another captured document, a letter from a Viet Cong cadre to his family, expressed relief at being transferred away from an area where Australians operated, describing them as more dangerous than Americans because they were invisible until they attacked. Post-war interviews with former NVA officers consistently describe Australian units with a respect and sometimes a fear not extended to American units. One former NVA battalion commander stated in an interview decades after the war that his unit lost more men to Australian patrols than to American operations, 3 times larger, and that he ordered his soldiers to avoid Australian units whenever possible because engaging them resulted in casualties his unit could not afford. This fear was not based on propaganda or rumor. It was based on experience, on the accumulated evidence of hundreds of encounters in which Australian units demonstrated capabilities that seemed almost superhuman. The North Vietnamese were not naive. They had been fighting for decades. They had defeated the French. They were in the process of outlasting the Americans. They understood warfare, understood tactics, understood how to exploit enemy weaknesses. But they could not find a weakness to exploit in Australian SAS operations. The Australians did not move predictably. They did not establish patterns. They did not rely on firepower that could be avoided or technology that could be countered. They relied on skills that could not be countered, on patience that could not be rushed, on discipline that could not be broken, and on an understanding of jungle warfare that exceeded anything the North Vietnamese had encountered before. The contrast with American operations highlights why the North Vietnamese feared Australians differently. American operations were dangerous because of their scale and firepower. An American battalion sweep might kill hundreds of enemy soldiers. An American artillery barrage could destroy an entire base area. An American B-52 strike could turn jungle into moonscape, but these operations, for all their destructiveness, were survivable if you knew they were coming, and the Americans often telegraphed their intentions. Helicopter insertions could be heard from kilometers away. Major operations required days of preparation that intelligence could detect. American units moved with enough noise that ambushes could be prepared in advance. The Americans were dangerous, but they were predictable. The Australians were dangerous precisely because they were not predictable. An Australian patrol might be anywhere, An ambush might happen at any time. A trail you had walked safely for months might suddenly become a killing ground, and there was no defense except to not be there, which meant ceding control of territory, abandoning supply routes, and accepting operational restrictions that significantly reduced military effectiveness. From a North Vietnamese perspective, Australian units punched far above their weight, creating problems out of proportion to their numbers, and there was no good solution. Fighting them directly usually resulted in heavy casualties. Avoiding them meant accepting limits on movement and operations. Either way, the Australians were winning a battle of attrition that the North Vietnamese could not afford. The toll this took on Australian soldiers is difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. They were volunteers, all of them, drawn to special operations by a desire to test themselves against the hardest challenges military service offered. They were professionals who took pride in their skills and their unit, but they were also human, and the stress of continuous operations in hostile territory under conditions of extreme danger inevitably left marks. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not well understood in the 1960s and 1970s. Soldiers were expected to handle whatever combat threw at them, and to not talk about it afterward. Many Australian Vietnam veterans struggled for decades with memories of things they had seen and done, with the transition from a world where hypervigilance kept you alive to a world where such vigilance was pathological, and with a society that did not always understand or appreciate their service. The political context of the Vietnam War complicated this transition. As the war became increasingly unpopular, particularly in the late 1960s and early 1970s, soldiers returning from Vietnam often faced hostility rather than gratitude. Australian society, like American society, was deeply divided over the war, and soldiers bore the brunt of that division. For SAS veterans, the situation was even more complex. Their operations were classified. They could not discuss what they had done. They carried secrets they were forbidden to share, and those secrets included missions into Cambodia that remained classified for decades. These men had served with extraordinary distinction, had achieved things that, from a purely military perspective, were remarkable, but they came home to a country that often treated Vietnam veterans as embarrassments rather than heroes, and they could not even defend their service by explaining what they had actually accomplished. The secrecy surrounding Cambodia operations reflects the political complexity of the Vietnam War. The United States, bound by congressional restrictions and diplomatic considerations, officially respected Cambodian neutrality even as North Vietnamese forces used Cambodia as a sanctuary. Australia, not bound by the same restrictions, conducted operations that American forces could not, and the intelligence gathered by Australian SAS patrols proved crucial for planning the 1970 Cambodian incursion. But acknowledging these operations would have required admitting that Allied forces had been violating Cambodian sovereignty for years, and such an admission carried diplomatic consequences neither the United States nor Australia wanted to face. So the operations remained classified, the soldiers involved were sworn to secrecy, and for decades, one of the most effective special operations campaigns of the Vietnam War remained unknown to historians and to the public. Only in recent years, as documents have been declassified and as veterans have begun to share their experiences, has the full scope of Australian SAS operations in Vietnam become clear, and with that clarity has come recognition of what these soldiers achieved. They conducted more than 1,100 patrols over 6 years. They achieved a kill ratio that remains unmatched in modern warfare. They gathered intelligence that shaped strategic planning. They dominated an area of operations with a force that never exceeded 120 men. They conducted cross-border operations that remained classified for half a century. And they did all of this with a professionalism and a tactical acumen that earned the respect of their allies and the fear of their enemies. The question of why the North Vietnamese feared Australian SAS more than the American Army is, in the end, a question about the nature of fear itself. The Americans were feared for their power, for what they could do when they brought their full capabilities to bear. The Australians were feared for their presence, for the fact that they might be anywhere, watching, waiting, and you would never know until it was too late. The Americans represented the fear of overwhelming force. Basic. The Australians represented the fear of the unknown, of the invisible enemy, who struck without warning and disappeared without trace. Both fears are powerful, but the fear of the unknown, the fear of an enemy who seems to operate outside normal rules, who seems almost supernatural in his capabilities, that fear burrows deeper and lasts longer. For the men of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment who served in Vietnam, recognition came late, but it came. The unit's effectiveness is now studied in military academies around the world. Their tactics influenced special operations doctrine for multiple nations. The phrase "jungle ghosts," given to them by their enemies, has become a source of pride. And while the political debates about the Vietnam War will never be fully resolved, the tactical excellence of these soldiers is beyond dispute. They were given an impossible mission: to dominate hostile territory with minimal resources, and they succeeded through skill, discipline, courage, and an understanding of warfare that proved superior to conventional military thinking. The legacy of the Australian SAS in Vietnam extends beyond their immediate tactical achievements. They demonstrated that in certain types of warfare, small units of highly trained soldiers can achieve effects far beyond what their numbers suggest. They proved that patience and intelligence can be more valuable than firepower and speed. They showed that understanding your enemy, learning his patterns, exploiting his weaknesses, and operating with absolute discipline can create advantages that technology cannot replicate. These lessons remain relevant today as modern military forces grapple with asymmetric threats, irregular warfare, and operations in complex terrain where traditional advantages of technology and firepower are diminished. For the North Vietnamese Army, the Australian presence in Vietnam represented a problem they never fully solved. They adapted to American tactics. They learned to avoid American firepower. They developed methods to survive American bombing campaigns, but they never developed effective countermeasures to Australian patrolling. The best they could do was avoid areas where Australians operated, and even that was not always possible. The Australians had achieved something rare in modern warfare. They had imposed their will on the enemy, through skill alone, without overwhelming numbers or technology, and they had done so consistently over years of operations. In the years after the Vietnam War ended, as scholars and military historians began to analyze what had worked and what had not, the Australian experience emerged as one of the war's most interesting case studies. Here was a force that had succeeded by almost every tactical metric, that had achieved remarkable results with minimal casualties, that had earned the respect and fear of a formidable enemy. Yet their story had been largely unknown, hidden behind classification, and overshadowed by the broader American experience. As more information became available, as veterans began to speak, as documents were declassified, the full picture emerged, and with it came questions about whether other approaches might have worked better, whether lessons learned in Malaya and applied in Vietnam might have changed the war's trajectory if adopted more broadly. These questions are, of course, impossible to answer definitively. The Vietnam War was lost or won, depending on your perspective, for reasons that went far beyond tactics. Political will, strategic objectives, the nature of the conflict itself, all these factors mattered more than how effectively any particular unit fought. But the Australian SAS experience does suggest that different approaches were possible, that the conventional American emphasis on firepower and mobility was not the only way, perhaps not even the best way, to conduct counterinsurgency operations in jungle terrain against an elusive enemy. The Australians had proven that small, highly skilled units operating with patience and intelligence could achieve remarkable results, and that effectiveness did not require overwhelming force. The men who served in these units knew what they had accomplished, even when others did not. They knew they had operated at the edge of human capability, that they had faced an enemy that gave no quarter and expected none, that they had survived through skill and luck and the support of the men beside them. They knew that their operations had made a difference, that enemy forces had changed their behavior because of Australian presence, that intelligence they gathered had shaped operations far larger than any patrol. They knew, even when they could not speak of it, that they had been part of something extraordinary, and that knowledge, for many of them, was enough. March 14, 1969. The Cambodian border region. 6 Australian soldiers extract from their observation position after 9 days of watching an NVA supply trail. They have not spoken above a whisper in more than a week. They have been motionless for hours at a time. They are exhausted, filthy, soaked in their own sweat, covered in leeches and insect bites. The intelligence they carry, detailed observations of enemy movements, strengths, and patterns, will inform planning for operations months in the future. The enemy never knew they were there. That is the point. That is what makes them ghosts. That is why across the border, in base camps and along supply routes, North Vietnamese commanders warn their soldiers about the Australians with a fear they do not express about any other enemy. Because fighting an army you can see is one thing. Fighting an enemy you cannot hear, cannot see, cannot predict, an enemy who watches you for days and strikes with precision you cannot counter, that is something else entirely. That is what the Australian Special Air Service Regiment brought to the Vietnam War, and that is why, decades later, their story remains one of the most remarkable special operations campaigns in modern military history.